Welcome everybody to episode 103 of Axioms on Trial. I think it's 103. Let me know if you guys can hear me okay. I'm going to bring in my guest. How's it going?
Good. How about you?
Great. Thank you so much for joining me. Why don't you give our audience a little bit of a background in who you are, and then we can get started.
Okay, cool. I am young baby Tate. My real name is Tate Medina. I'm a content creator on TikTok of all places. So I'm a Roman Catholic, so that means I'm a Christian theist, a classical theist, and yeah, I have a lot of different. I make a lot of different content on TikTok, just kind of exposing people to a more intellectual side of Christianity, as well as other topics like pro-life. I'm getting into the philosophy of gender as well, and so yeah, those are like my three, I guess you could say, specialties when I make content on TikTok: theism, uh, pro-life versus pro-choice, and then also every now and again I'll talk about the philosophy of gender.
Okay, great. Thank you for letting us know. Yeah, maybe we can see within the time that we have how much we can get through those topics. I definitely want to understand your perspective and justification for your side of it. I guess I want to start by asking you what has convinced you that the Christian God is real. What are the arguments that you would pose, and what is your evidence to support your worldview?
Okay, so I guess for starters, I know evidence can be kind of a loaded term sometimes,
Sure.
so it's definitely going to depend on what we mean by evidence. If by evidence what we mean is rational warrants, then I can give, you know, I can. I'm convinced that Christianity and a particular form of Christianity called Roman Catholicism is true, essentially due to a cumulative case.
Mhm.
It starts with belief in God. I know sometimes you'll run into Christians who, oh my gosh, I almost knocked that over. I know sometimes you'll run into Christians who will just try to argue straight from like the resurrection of Jesus to show that Christianity is true, and they'll argue that with atheists. I don't think that's a good line of argumentation, because if atheism is true, or I guess I should say if naturalism is true, naturalism being the view that the only thing that exists is, matter and energy within space and time. Would you say that's an accurate characterization of naturalism?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. If naturalism is true, then rising from the dead is not possible. Well,
Or
not let's say not possible. It's so incredibly unlikely that you'll prefer almost any other natural explanation to
right.
arising from the dead.
Sure. Like I think it's still be possible. What matters is, can we provide naturalistic evidence? Like we can provide evidence that is not just like a possibility in terms of like an epistemic technicality. Like we can't disprove it, therefore it could be the case, as opposed to like, are we justified in thinking that it actually did happen?
Right, 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 right. Okay. Um, but anyways, I guess my point was that to an atheist, uh, the explanation for, let's say, the empty tomb or what have you, whatever arguments you're going to put forward in favor of the resurrection, it's going to an atheist, it's going to seem like the last possible explanation would be that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. It's going to be much more likely that he's going to opt for any possible naturalistic explanation, and even a bunch of, you know, a conglomerate of unlikely explanations strung together to account for the data.
Sure.
But that's why I think that you actually need to start with arguing for the existence of God. Because if God is in the picture, now we have a causal power that
Right.
makes miracles more likely.
Hmm.
It makes the resurrection of Jesus a plausible option among other naturalistic explanations. Obviously, it doesn't just follow from God's existence that Jesus rose from the dead. But so yeah, I definitely think that the fundamental bedrock of my worldview is that God exists.
Right.
So If I had to give arguments for why I believe that God exists, I would say that probably the strongest argument that I definitely look into the most, that I definitely think is the strongest argument for God's existence is, if you want to state it formally, it's the Aristotelian argument from motion, as articulated by Aristotle, by Thomas Aquinas. More modern thinkers like Edward Feser endorse it
Yeah,
and strengthen it. Um, Popularly, it's probably just known as the contingency argument or the argument from change.
right.
So I also think that the moral argument is a very strong argument for God, not just like the plain potatoes moral argument. Oh, where do you get your morality from, then, atheists? Like it would be a more sophisticated, beefed up version of it. Something like, honestly, I'm still pretty partial to C.S. Lewis's argument from morality for God. Um, I think that if you want to say that morality is entirely subjective, then I would opt for maybe John Henry Newman's version of the moral argument.
And could you elaborate on C.S. Lewis's argument for just for the audience? Also, I'm a more realist, so I'm not going to take the subjectivist approach.
Yeah, okay. So I guess C.S. Lewis's moral argument, let's see if I can pull it up from memory. It's going to be something like, people argue with each other and people behave as though there is a moral standard upon which either everyone agrees upon or upon which everyone should agree upon. Now, he's going to argue that this therefore means that there are moral facts, and or he could say that you could say that he's arguing that moral realism is true, and where he's going to go from there is he's going to rule out the possibility of naturalistic explanations that could explain away or account for either moral realism or naturalistic explanations that are going to explain away moral realism. And then he's going to come to the conclusion that essentially it seems like this is the part where I think that C.S. Lewis has to put in the most work, and where he doesn't put the most work in Mere Christianity is getting from moral realism to God. So I guess maybe I'm not articulating this as well as I could.
Muffin says C.S. Lewis's argument can be entirely debunked by social animals and evolutionary instincts. While I do think, from my view, that yes, there's a social or there's an evolutionary aspect in how we can talk of moral realism, I actually don't ground, or things like empathy, for example. There's an evolutionary value to that. I ground my moral realism in phenomenology as a
Yeah.
foundation.
To respond to Muffin Pup, I guess C.S. Lewis actually addresses that exact objection in the book when he presents it. So I guess if I can remember what C.S. Lewis would say, he would probably say something like, okay, so you're saying that morality actually comes from and is grounded in evolution, the fact that we are social creatures, right? So this is what he refers to it as in the early 1950s vernacular was the herd instinct, right? But he was talking about the same thing. He was aware of this objection even in the 1950s, and his way of kind of rebutting that objection was essentially to say, sure, we have instincts and we know what it's like to be prompted by instincts. And he gives an example of someone walking past a lake, and it turns out that they discover that someone is drowning in the lake. They're screaming help. You're going to be prompted by an instinct. You're actually going to be prompted by two instincts. The first instinct would be to, preserve the species and save the person, right? To have empathy for them, right? I hear the word empathy used a lot as an account for moral realism grounded in evolution. So let's say one instinct is have empathy, aka preserve the species for evolutionary benefit. There's going to be a second instinct. There's going to be a second instinct though, which is preserve your own life. And C.S. Lewis bets that that second instinct is actually going to be stronger. Now what C.S. Lewis is saying is that there's a moral standard or a moral law, so to speak, that is going to press upon your conscience and say one of these two instincts in this scenario is correct. And it's actually not going to be the self-preservation instinct. Generally animals follow whichever instinct is stronger. But C.S. Lewis points out that what's interesting is that oftentimes when your conscience steps in and says, this is what you need to do, it's usually pointing at the weaker instinct and saying, no, 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 that's what you need to do. So I think that might be part of how C.S. Lewis is going to respond to that objection.
Yeah, the reason why I don't take the evolutionary approach is because, like you said, we have all kinds of instincts, some positive, some destructive. For me, the distinction, the only thing necessary to ground morality in objective terms is that the idea that consciousness has a nature, that there are certain behaviors that will lead to flourishing and certain behaviors that will lead to harm. So when we use words like good and evil, we're basically talking about harm reduction. And we don't need to pose any kind of metaphysical source or deity to recognize that there are facts we can learn about our conscious experience. And if consciousness has a nature, then some things are going to be true universally. And it's not about that so and so subject values a specific thing just like by themselves. The question is, why do they value the thing? Where does value come from? Is it just random, or is there something that there's something about the type of beings that we are that necessarily brings about certain kinds of values? So like if all of us had access to the full spectrum of experience, would it be possible for somebody to not value a higher state of well-being and value a worse state of certain kinds of suffering? And I want to say that I don't think that would be existentially possible once having had the experience.
Okay, so it seems like what you're saying is that ideally, if everyone had is what you're saying that if everyone had the proper epistemic framework, it just wouldn't be the case that anyone would desire things which you would consider to be evil or destructive?
Yeah, like I think that most often than not, people think they're doing the right thing, and they don't realize they're actually harming themselves. It's like saying, at one point we didn't know that smoking cigarettes was unhealthy, right? Doesn't mean that like just because people believed it wasn't unhealthy is not relevant to the reality of the situation. Just because some people think that they're doing something right doesn't mean that they're ultimately actually not doing something wrong. And these words like right and wrong is we're all having subjective experiences in the sense that we're all different people. But the whole point of phenomenology as a field is that we can talk about subjective experience in objective terms, because it turns out subjective experience actually has a universality to it, a nature to it, that it's not,
Right.
But none of that requires any kind of belief that there has to be a source called God that has to ground any of this. Like it can just be a fact of nature.
I'm curious, did you come to that? This sounds a lot like Chomsky's view, right? The nexus of, I guess, the biological nature of human beings puts an actual hard limit on what can be the case about what's going to constitute good and evil, so to speak, for human beings. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
So I knew from Chomsky's perspective, and again, I'm no expert on Chomsky, but my understanding was that he had this view more in terms of language, that he thinks that there is some universality to how language develops.
That was one of his views, but he specifically had a moral view going along with that as well. He debated Michel Foucault on that back in
Right.
the
Okay.
70s.
Yeah, I watched part of that. yeah, I'm not as familiar with his moral view.
It
I
was
think
essentially that, if I'm understanding you correctly.
okay.
Maybe
Yeah,
I'm
but
not,
I'll have to
but
go back. I'll have to go back and watch it. I watched part of it a long time ago.
hmm
Um, I like certain aspects of Chomsky and others less so, but
right.
definitely one of the most brilliant minds for sure.
Oh, he was a genius.
I I, uh, I think someone like Sam Harris gets a lot of um, he gets a bad rap in the kind of philosophy circles because I think that he doesn't defend his moral framework well. But I think the foundations and the principles that he applied in the moral landscape, I think are correct. It's
So
just
you
that
think
he
he
does
does a
a
good
shit
job,
job
like
at
he does a good
yeah.
job of like developing the framework, but not necessarily like justifying it in itself.
He does a good job at providing the initial foundation, like where the conversation should be headed, but then completely fails to actually defend it the way that I think it should be defended.
Right.
And so I feel like when I read the book, it kind of felt like he was speaking to my intuitions on the matter. But then I felt unsatisfied because I felt like, well, this is not really addressing like the Aesop problem, for example, which I don't think is an issue, but many
Mhm.
people do. He doesn't tackle it the way that I would.
Yeah.
Um, and so like I don't think that there is any like there may be a logical issue, like you can't derive an ought from an is in terms of pure logic, but existentially there's no problem there. I don't think that like when we're talking about oughts, we're always concerned with goals, and when we're talking about moral oughts, we're concerned with how do we derive well-being, both individually and socially, from any given
Mhm.
action.
I
Um,
think I think
yeah,
part of the reason that I'm not pushing back on you all that much is pretty much because I agree with you.
yeah,
Right.
right, and right because unlike a lot of atheists, I am a moral realist, and
hmm
and that's the thing that I think we've watched the debate with Harris and William Lane Craig is that Harris actually makes his point to Craig. He says, "You ultimately have the same framework I do. You're just concerned about well-being and suffering on another spectrum. Like you think that this goes on towards hell and heaven, and you care about an eternity of well-being with God, as opposed to an eternity of suffering in hell. But you're still concerned about the same fundamental issues.
hmm
And so, yeah, I don't think that we're going to be in disagreement on the point. It's just that what I don't understand is the step you take to say that somehow we need to make an extra assumption and bring God into it, as opposed to just looking at it as this is just nature.
Okay. So I think this might be where. Okay, yeah. So this is where I am going to start to push back. Is I'm going to say yes, the closed system that you have proposed is pretty much accurate to what I, as a Catholic, as someone who subscribes to the natural law moral theory, is going to say. I actually agree with you. I
Mm,
agree that the essential end of the moral game, as far as humans are concerned, is human flourishing, right?
right.
Because, and I mean, if you want to throw theism in there, it's because God wills for humans to flourish because he loves them. But that's not necessarily the key to my argument here.
Mm.
You've proposed this great closed system of what it is that constitutes moral actions in order to pursue human flourishing. My concern is that it's an ungrounded system because why pursue human flourishing?
Okay, so I find that question because I hear that all the time, right?
Mhm.
well, why do we value well-being? That to me is a question that misses the point.
It's not
It's like
why do we value well-being. I think that everyone kind of intuitively understands we all want well-being, so to speak. But for one thing, why pursue human flourishing on a larger scale, I guess, so to speak, and then just why are humans good in and of themselves, right? This is the threat of antinatalism or of just of misanthropy in general.
so two ways to answer that. One, why we should pursue well-being on a larger scale it's because there is still a connection between the individual scale and and the societal scale. They're not. There may be situations where there may be tension, where the two may seem in opposition, and then I
Mhm.
think the question becomes more complicated. But um, I think more often than not, they're actually going to be in harmony, and because I can't, we don't exist in a vacuum as individuals. We exist in a society. So
Right.
in valuing my well-being, I'm going to value the well-being of society because the well-being of society is going to affect my well-being.
Okay, so have you read C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man at any point?
I don't think I did.
Okay, that I'd recommend you check that book out. It's a pretty short book. It's probably actually where he formulates a version of the moral argument, the strongest that he can. What he essentially does in that book is essentially he kind of talks about moral realism and the objectivity of transcendentals like truth, goodness, and beauty. Um, but toward the end of the book, he starts playing out this essentially this scenario involving things like birth control, eugenics. Essentially, he proposes this kind of tyrannical society that does tyrannical, so to speak, this extremely authoritarian group of elites who are able to just bring about only the best of humans using things like birth control. I guess today we would say things like IVF and other things like that, and brings about this society that seem using a lot of means that we would probably intuitively want to say no, this isn't okay. But what he ends with is a not a flourishing society, so to speak, but like a stable one, right? Where people are experiencing things that they want to experience. I'm sure Colton asked you this question too, but another line of argumentation I could take, I'd have to go back and read The Abolition of Man myself to kind of get the full breadth of Lewis's argument. But I think Colton asked you this question as well. Um, would it be unethical to genetically engineer, say, a human fetus to make it so that what constitutes well-being for them is going to be something different, possibly even something evil, like the way a fetus, the way that that human being, when it develops, will experience well-being is to maybe it enjoys being killed and being and having its organs harvested, or maybe it finds fulfillment in chattel slavery.
So I think that is primarily what I'm saying is existentially impossible. Not maybe not logically, but existentially impossible. Where I'm not when I talk about well-being and suffering, I'm not talking about mere pleasure and pain.
Well, no,
Like we know,
I'm not saying that either.
yeah. Like I don't think that we, by virtue of what we are as conscious beings, um, there are certain states of experience that are intrinsically going to be better than others, and I don't think it could be possible.
Why are they intrinsically better than others? I'm not saying you don't have an answer. I'd like to know.
But by the content of the experience itself, that intrinsic, it's like saying, why is not having my hand on a hot stove better than having the hand on a hot stove? Because there was like the language and the justifications seem to me to be secondary to what we find is intrinsically the case in the experience itself. That we have an experience, we recognize its content, and then we compare and contrast those experiences with other experiences, and then we create a sort of spectrum and a categorization of what we mean when we talk about well-being and suffering.
Sure, but that would be from the perspective of a human with its typical nature, so to speak. But when you're talking about genetically engineering a human fetus, for instance, to find deep fulfillment in something that normal humans would recognize as intrinsically evil, like
So that's what I'm saying, that I'm not
becoming
just talking about,
property.
right. So what I'm trying to say is that I'm not referring to, like, let me say this in two ways. It may be true that, like, Harris talks about the moral landscape, right? Like, I'm not claiming that there's only one way to reach well-being, but just
I
as,
didn't think you were.
Right. Okay. So I just want to make sure clarify that also for the people listening. Um, but just as there may be a variety of ways to reach well-being, there are going to be a variety of objective ways to fail to reach those moral peaks and to actually find yourself in a valley of suffering.
To me, that kind of begs the question, though, of what constitutes a moral peak and why.
I think nature does. I think that like we. So when you say why couldn't we genetically modify somebody to value um, certain types of experiences, what I'm suggesting is that if I'm right about consciousness having the kind of nature that I am referring to, it would actually be impossible for that to be the case because the
Well,
experience itself would be intrinsically the type of thing that couldn't be manipulated in that way.
see, I guess I just disagree that that's the case, but I guess that's one way to argue against it. It is a hypothetical, though. So, but if
Sure.
you want to say that hypothetical is metaphysically possible to instantiate in reality, you know what? Fair enough.
Right.
Um,
Yeah,
I
I
guess
think
what I
that, yeah. Sorry, I was just going
it's
to say I make a weird distinction between logically possible and I think existentially possible. Like, I don't think there's any logical contradiction in saying
no,
that. Okay, just making sure.
yeah.
Go ahead.
So logically possible would be like on paper,
Right.
this track follows, right? A to B works. The problem is when you go and instantiate that into reality. That's called I guess an existential or metaphysical impossibility. It's like I don't know how you feel about infinite sets in mathematics, but it's like when mathematicians propose infinite sets, they're going to say, "Well, so that means infinity is real." A lot of thinkers would say, well, not so fast. Infinity is a logical possibility, but it's a metaphysical impossibility. It's not possible for infinity to be instantiated in reality.
Right. Yeah, and I want to clear something up too, because Muffin says Cease's view seems to be predicated on the average best outcome, given the average human mind, in which, in general, I agree with. Outliers obviously exist, but that's the nature of animals. I think I'm actually making a more extreme statement than that, because I think that there are certain fundamental truths of our phenomenology that I think are actually going to be true across the board, not on averages, but now there may be true that, for example, psychopaths are not going to feel empathy and are going to not have access to certain higher states of well-being. But these aren't people that have found like alternative ways of flourishing. They're people that unfortunately are are kind of stuck in, they basically have had biological bad luck and phenomenological bad luck, and so are kind of stuck in this perpetual state of a worse kind of experience than somebody who doesn't suffer from psychopathy might experience. Um, but what was I going to say? Oh, okay. Yeah. So were you going to add something more to the like? I guess
I
I'm
guess
trying to like how you ground it in God, like how you make that step to then say it makes more sense to add God on top of it.
right. So far it seems we essentially agree like on basically everything that we've talked about regarding moral realism so far because we're both moral realists and we both view the moral game with regards to humans as the pursuit of the flourishing of human nature.
Hmm.
So on an individual and societal level. So now I guess if I had to use an analogy, we both have the same shaped tree, but now what I'm going to do is argue that my tree is planted in the ground and your tree is not.
Right.
Which
And so right.
so I guess one thing that I'm gonna press now, and this is an argument that the bioethicist and philosopher Trent Horn is working on, um, the argument from human exceptionalism, or from human dignity, you could say also. This is a moral fact that I feel like naturalists are gonna have a much harder time grounding, which is that human well-being in itself is significant, or human nature in and of itself is a good to be pursued.
Wait, say that again. Say that one more time.
The flourishing of human nature in itself is an objective good to be pursued.
Yeah.
Can you
Yeah, I would agree.
ground that under naturalism?
Yeah, I think it's intrinsic in uh like this is what I mean when we use words like good and bad, we're describing the um, intrinsic nature of certain experiences. So to ask, this is why I said earlier why I think to ask is human flourishing good or worth pursuing. It's almost like I think a misuse of language. It's asking, is heat hot? From my perspective,
Okay, I
it's
see. So you're just positing that well-being is what we mean when we say
yeah,
good.
yes, and I don't think that is circular or like uh, self-defeating. I think it's how we use language. I think there are certain things that are definitional.
It's not circular or self-defeating, but it does kind of put you in a precarious place because all that would need to happen is for somebody else to come along and say, well, I don't think that well-being is what is good. And because you can also, there's another way to define good. And I think this is the way that a classical theist might, or a natural law theist might want to define it, which is that which is desirable in and of itself.
Yeah, but I don't think that my
But I don't
view.
think you've shown why human flourishing is desirable in and of itself.
Right, so I think it is. So yeah, I would disagree with that. I think that it's shown that to be the case by virtue of what the phenomenological state shows us intrinsically. That like this is um, like when you say, how do I say this? If somebody came to me and said, "Well, I don't care about well-being," or why I don't care to value well-being, that wouldn't be a defeater for my position any more than somebody saying, "I don't value health." Like you don't have to value health if you don't want to value health, but then you can't claim to call yourself healthy, right? Like it, it's the same thing to me. Like if somebody doesn't want to value well-being, again, I don't think that ultimately that is a credible thing one can find. But let's say that that's the case, fine. But you couldn't say that then they were being immoral. They could just say, I value being immoral, but that wouldn't be the kind of value that we're referring to when we're differentiating between moral and immoral agents. Like they would
Yeah.
admittedly have decided that they were immoral.
Yeah.
I don't think that when you say how I justify it being good in and of itself, I think just by virtue of what the phenomenology is, that that is how we recognize what is intrinsically better than others, just by the experiences.
Okay. I think I understand.
Yeah.
So I guess another question, maybe another way to propose it would be this: something is good when it is achieving its ontological perfection, so to speak. It's fulfilling everything proper to its nature, right?
Wait, ask that again.
Something is good when it achieves its ontological perfection, so to speak. It fulfills everything that is proper to its nature. Something, or when
No,
it
I think
tends toward that.
no, I think something is good when it propels us towards flourishing.
I
Because
think that's what we're. I think that's what I'm saying, just in different language
okay,
and in like not non-personal language. This can apply to things that aren't persons as well, moral
okay.
agents as
I,
well.
I do want to answer to this real quick. If it is societal well-being or individual being, do we pivot into a utilitarian model? Well, I think the two are connected. Like I don't think you can separate the two.
I
Now,
agree.
there are issues with purely like I'm not a pure utilitarian, although my view, I think a lot of it is utilitarian, yes. But I'm not arguing for just like how do I say this? Like even if the moral arithmetics might not make sense, like I'm not arguing to like vivisect one person to save five other people, even if it seems like that would lead to more well-being, actually, for all of us to live in that kind of society would have certain psychological consequences that would be detrimental.
I guess I
Uh,
do have one question. I don't know if you've heard of this thought experiment before. It
I
wasn't even a
know what
thought
you're gonna say.
experiment, huh?
I think I know what you're going to say, but go ahead.
Um, well, I'm curious to know what you're thinking then.
Is it the example, the hypothetical of like giving everybody like a pill that just makes them feel like bliss just from a pill?
No, not like Brave New World or like a get put into a simulation. I think the
Okay.
studies are out on that. Like no one wants that.
Yeah.
That would constitute uh, a lack of human flourishing, even just objectively, not even just subjectively, right?
Mm.
Like people wouldn't be fulfilling what's proper to their human nature while they rot away in a hospital bed in in a VR headset, essentially, you know. But no, actually, this is. I don't know if it's a formal thought experiment that was proposed in philosophy, although philosophers have started to enjoy using it. I think it comes from a short story that was written. Essentially, what you have is this utopian city. You could even just say utopian society, utopian country, what have you, where humans are really flourishing. They're pursuing all their proper ends, and the society runs very smoothly. And it's all thanks to a marvelous working of technology. And eventually, one person discovers that in the inner workings of the city, down underneath below the city, there's one little 5-year-old girl being perpetually tortured, abused, terrified, just being subjected to the worst kind of suffering possible at all times. And it turns out that this is how this magnificent technology that powers this entire society is being powered.
Mm.
Does that constitute? Would it constitute an immoral action to step in and intervene, or would it constitute a moral action to pursue that
I
as
think,
an end?
sure. So I think that any violation on somebody's will and any cause of harm is going to be immoral. Now we can look at that on a spectrum, right? Like, are there certain actions that are going to be immoral but are going to be ultimately um, still preferable to other immoral actions? Like that might be a question. Sometimes they're going to be different actions are going to be in conflict, and they're both going to lead to something negative. Just one is going to lead to something less negative than another.
Yeah,
Um,
sometimes you have to choose the lesser of two evils.
right. And I guess what I would say to that um, is that, like, I can always imagine another hypothetical where you could find alternative ways of reaching the same kind of well-being without it being at the expense or the cost of the little girl. Um, I'm not gonna say that I have like all the moral answers as to what we should do in that situation, but I would still say that that society doing that action, causing that girl suffering, would still be immoral. Whether it's justified in a larger context is the question. But certainly intuitively, I would want to say um,
Oh
we could
yeah,
like
intuitively, like no one wants to sit there and say, "Oh yeah, screw that girl."
right. And the thing is, like, why are those the options? Like, couldn't there be a way to lead us to flourish without it being at the expense of any person? Then that would be the better framework. Um, so I know that's kind of an unsatisfactory answer, uh, but again, I guess I'm still trying to kind of wrap my head around like where God comes into this for you. Like, why is that a better
Sure.
explanation?
So I explained earlier that what I think actually constitutes good would just be the something tending towards or achieving its ontological perfection, the perfection of its nature. Now, this is going to be important because on theism, ontological God is ontologically perfect in the more universal sense of that word, if that makes sense. He's perfect in and of himself. He has a wholly fulfilled nature. One way that I could put it is that he's purely actual, right? He doesn't have any potentials that have yet to be fulfilled. I don't think that this necessarily constitutes, although a moral argument for God's existence, but it constitutes an argument in favor of theism having a proper grounding of morality against naturalism.
See, I maybe I'm not understanding fully, but I don't see the connection. Like, I don't see why we should assume any of those things. It kind of seems arbitrary to me.
No. I'm saying I guess what I'm not doing here currently as we're talking in this conversation, what I'm not doing is arguing from morality to God's existence.
Okay.
What I'm doing now is I'm arguing that theism as a model has a proper grounding for moral realism, and I think that I think is preferable to naturalism.
But I guess that's what I'm failing to understand, because in naturalism, I have something concrete that I can point to, which is, even though we don't know fully what consciousness is or where it arises from, there are certain things we can observe and have observed about its nature. Right? This is something concrete. I don't believe the same can be said for theism. We don't have that concrete.
Can you explain why we don't have that? I mean, part of the joy of theism, at least unless you're like a crazy fundamentalist, is that the natural gets thrown in with it. So I
Sure,
don't
but
see why we don't have. That's why I was pointing out that we have the same shaped tree. It's only that I'm going to argue that my tree is actually planted in the ground.
yeah, but the problem is that there is nothing that a theist so far has been able to show me that can ground that assumption into something that's beyond imaginary. So, like, if you want to say you feel like morality is more grounded because you think it comes from God, and theism is the grounding for morality.
It's kind of an oversimplification, but yeah.
And I guess from my perspective, it's like, well, to me, the whole theistic view is completely on shaky grounds to begin with, because what methodology do you have?
Sure. But this isn't necessarily an argument for the existence of God. This is an
Sure.
argument that
No, I get
theism
it.
as a pre-existing model has a better standing for how to ground morality than
But I guess for me
naturalism.
to
That's
buy
all
in,
I'm saying here.
no, that's fair. But for me to buy into that statement, I would have to buy into theism as a pre-existing model to be a justified model, and I don't think it is the
So
problem.
I guess that's a separate consideration
Yeah.
then.
Real quick,
So
also, which is when I say this before, like, anytime I hear the word perfection, immediately I don't know what is being meant by that. Like, when you talk about, you said
there's
living up.
perfection in the absolute sense, which is something. It's another way to just say that it's fully actualized, fully realized.
So, but
And
couldn't
then
someone evil fully actualize their nature, and that be perfect in things?
see, that's perfection, like with a lowercase p. It's a different but similar sense of the word, I guess, is what I was getting at, which is why I kind of shifted to language of fulfillment of natures. But then those natures constitute the way that I'm going to ground this in theism is that the natures themselves constitute their own reflection toward a greater ontological perfection. And if there is something which is truly ontologically perfect, like God, that let's say is the architect of all these other natures, then we can say it is good, and what I mean by good here is desirable in and of itself to pursue the flourishing of a nature.
Yeah, I guess fundamentally, I think this is where I run into these problems because for me, perfection is a word without content, without reference, and it's like to buy into the theistic model to begin with. I would need the kind of justification that can ground these things to be more than mere ideas. And
Okay, so I guess your issue isn't necessarily then. Okay, I think I see what you're saying. It's essentially that is it a set I'm gonna ask if I'm getting you right here. Is it that you're saying that okay, maybe I could buy into that, but the concept of perfection of ontological perfection itself, I view as problematic because I don't believe theism is true.
it's I think it's worse than that. I think that linguistically, you're not actually saying anything when you say ontologically perfect, um, any more than when I hear like when people say, I'm not saying you think this, but when people say like God exists outside of space and time,
Oh, I think
because
that.
okay, so I would say that from my understanding of what these words mean, the only reference we have to existence is within a context of space and time. And so we wouldn't even be able to conceive of something existing outside of that context unless there is some other type of space and time that we that would be separate from
Okay,
it.
so I guess this is a great segue just into talking about the existence of God itself.
And maybe we can talk about the contingency stuff as well.
Yeah.
Actually, before
So,
we
I
get
mean,
there, can I just Muffin wants to know, can you ask him if morality is just what God says and well-being is what God says is good for us?
is this a kind of Euthyphro dilemma, essentially?
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Um, so it seems if I'm gonna try and steel man his argument here to try and beef it up a bit. There's an old problem for theism called the Euthyphro dilemma, and for people who don't know what that is, it's essentially it comes from Plato's. Is it from Plato's or Socrates' dialogues? I don't
Um,
remember, but essentially it says that is something good because God commands it, or does God command
okay.
actions because those actions are good? And I guess what I can say is that as a classical theist, I don't really have a problem in this case because I'm going to argue that my argument for God's existence, let's say the argument from motion, it's going to come to something that is ontologically perfect. And I know that you're going to have plenty of things to say about that, Cease,
Mhm.
but this is just going to mean that God is perfectly fulfilled, that his nature is ontologically perfect. It's fully actualized, therefore it's good. God, now how this relates to moral commands, God made natures, right? So God made human nature and he made human nature as such that it's going to flourish a certain way. So moral prescriptions from God are going to take the form of they're going to take the form of essentially things that are going to be good for our human flourishing. This isn't to say that God is bound to a standard that is higher than himself, because remember that being human flourishing and human nature itself is going to be grounded in the goodness of its creator, which is God. So God isn't being held to any standard higher than himself here. Maybe it is what I'm saying at least tracking with you,
Yeah,
even
it
if you
is.
disagree.
Sure, it is, but yeah, it's tracking. I guess my contention is like all these seem to be unnecessary assumptions. Like you're adding extra ontologies that I think are not needed to ground moral realism. It's not that it doesn't. Again, it seems to
Sure,
me
it was just
it's
to answer
consistent.
his
Sure,
question.
sure.
I think yeah, it would be essentially to put it into short form without all the jargon. Something is good God commands something good for human beings because it's going to be something good for human beings. But human beings flourishing is going to finally be grounded in the fact that human nature is a good created by something perfect. So I guess another way to put it is that human nature is made in the image of God. So God made human nature in and of itself as something good. So it is proper to say that human beings should pursue their human flourishing, but that doesn't mean that God can just arbitrarily command humans to do whatever he wants, whatever he would want them to do, whatever that would even mean. God couldn't just arbitrarily send us a command to say rape babies.
Yeah.
Because that would be contrary to our human nature. So that would
Well,
that would constitute God contradicting his divine wisdom.
so
It
yeah,
would contradict God's own nature.
I'm okay. So I'm glad that you're not like a divine command theorist.
Ugh, no, that's gross.
But I guess again, what I fail to understand, and maybe we can go into the the next part of the conversation with the contingency stuff. But for you to say that the naturalism has less foundation than theism, you would have to show why that is the case. Because from my perspective, the grounding for naturalism in the moral sphere is very concrete, and I feel like on your end, you're adding ontologies without, I think, successful justification that I think
See,
are
but
unnecessary.
the only thing that I'm arguing is, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you
Very
off.
fun.
Okay, the only thing that I'm arguing here is that if it turns out that my ontologies, I guess what I'm assuming what you mean by that is the existence of God and his ontological perfection, or his perfection, the perfection of his very objective existence and nature, for people who are a bit confused by the jargon. I'm only arguing that if it is the case that God exists and all this stuff comes along, then theism is a superior model to naturalism.
Well, it's a superior model, not epistemically currently, because, like, because the thing is, things. Okay, reality is what it is, right? Like, either I'm right or you're right.
Mhm.
But the question is, how do we justify our worldviews?
Yeah.
And what reasons and what evidence do we have to say that our views is more justified than the next?
Mhm.
Could turn out that my view could turn out to be false,
Yeah.
but currently I would say that I'm still more justified epistemically than a theist, because I don't think that theists can provide justification to show that their beliefs aren't purely imaginary. So,
See,
so I
I
don't.
guess all I was trying to do is defend myself against the charge that like theism isn't that moral realism under theism doesn't actually constitute a more substantial or more grounded view.
Well, it doesn't if you can't ground, like, I don't think it does if you can't ground theism in the begin, like from the get go. Like, you can't just say,
Right,
"Well,
I agree
this
with
is
you.
true."
Yeah, I think that we're in agreement here. I guess all I was saying is that I think at some point the conversation came up. It was something that maybe Sam Harris said. It's like, you and I agree. You're just
Yeah,
adding unnecessary extra steps.
which I think you
I'm
are.
gonna say, what I'm gonna say is that no, these aren't unnecessary steps. If it turns out that these things are true, then they provide a superior moral framework in
I
and
don't
of
think.
itself than naturalism.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I see that, but I guess my concern is more about whether or not we're justified. Like, we can just navigate what we believe on. Well, if this is true, we have to look at, you know,
Of course.
right.
So yeah, this is a good segue to just talk about whether God exists, whether that is
Sure.
justified belief
And
or
you
not.
mentioned the contingency argument, the argument for motion. Are you equipped to provide the audience with that argument, or I know this is more of like a more relaxed conversation.
Yeah, I might have it here. Let's see. I kind of scribbled out. a simplified version of it because Caesar's version has like 60 premises, and
I
I'm
know.
not about to read all that out.
I gotta find you
No, I think it's a
episode.
good argument. Come on now.
I gotta find you the episode we did with my brother on this argument and its problems. I gotta find where it is on the list. But in the meantime, yeah, like
So
um,
this is the argument from change, or sometimes it's called the Aristotelian argument, or sometimes, if you want to get really general, it can be called the contingency argument for God's
mhm,
existence. The first premise is that change occurs, and change is something going from potential to actual. So let's say, for example, I've got this cup of water here, and if I were to throw it on the ground, then its potential to be destroyed would be actualized by my throwing it on the ground. You could also say that this water, in virtue of it being what it is, has the potentiality to become ice. It has the potentiality to evaporate. It has the potentiality to boil, to, if I mix certain ingredients into it, to become Kool-Aid. But potentiality is not unlimited. This water doesn't necessarily, per se, as water, have the potentiality to become a chicken or to grow legs and start walking. So change occurs, and change is when something goes from potential to actual. The actualization of any potential requires something already actual. This is essentially just stating cause and effect. So if I were to ask the question, why is this water in the glass only 1/4 full? I could say, well, because its potential to be that way was actualized by me drinking it. That's one way. It's maybe a simplified way to get the principle across, right? And I, the cause of the water being this way, am myself actual. What this is just trying to say is that a potentiality can't bring itself into existence. If this water was a full glass, it couldn't just actualize its own potential to be a 1/4 full glass. Again, if you want, you could pick holes in the example itself, but this is just to illustrate the general principle.
mhm.
Now, if it turns out that the actual thing which actualizes something else is contingent, meaning it has the potential to be otherwise, or rather it is a combination of potentiality and actuality, then it too would require something actual to actualize its potential to be the way that it actually is. It's just essentially stating the fact that there are causal sequences of causes. There are causal chains. So you can think about the rock is being moved on the grass. Now, that rock's potential to change positions on the grass is being actualized by the stick that's pushing the rock. And that stick's potential to have the power to push that rock is being actualized by, sorry, that comment popped up and I was reading it and got
No, no
lost
worries.
my
Sorry.
train of thought. So we have the rock. Its potential to be moved across the grass is being actualized by a stick, and that stick's potential to have that pushing power is being actualized by my hand. Right? This is just illustrating that there are causal chains. Right? If another way to put it is, if something in a chain of causes needs a cause for itself, then something else that's actual is going to have to cause it to be the way that it is in order for that thing to cause the next thing in the chain, so on and so forth. This means that contingent things have a chain of causes, potential things being actualized by a prior actualizer, which, if that actualizer is contingent, would also require its potential to be actualized by a prior actualizer. So on and so forth, repeat ad nauseum. The next premise would essentially be that going from potential to actual also applies to existence itself. I can hear your sighs. I know you're like, I disagree with so much of this.
Oh, it's yeah, it's so problematic. But I'm what's the word I'm thinking of? Um, I understand where you're coming from. Like I'm
Mhm.
sympathetic towards those intuitions,
Yeah.
which is why I think that as an argument, it's a reasonable one, but it's ultimately one that I think fails in light of modern physics. But I don't want to jump ahead. Like I want you to finish
Okay.
the.
Going from potential to actual also applies to existence itself. Why a particular thing exists at any given moment and in the way that it does requires an explanation in terms of its existence being actualized by prior actualizers. Which is to say, if I were to ask the question instead of, let's say, why is this cup of water lukewarm in temperature? Oh, well, that can be explained by the temperature of the room, and the temperature of the room is the way that it is because Antonio turned on the air conditioner yesterday, and like you can have a chain of causes that extends backward in time. And now what I'm going to argue is that there's another kind of chain of causes which doesn't by necessity extend backward in time. For instance, I could say, why is this water that is sitting on my desk 5 feet above the ground? That you would say, okay, well, that's not a cause. I could ask that question frozen in time. We could freeze this point in time, and I could say, why is that cup of water 5 feet above the ground? And you could explain that still in terms of causes of potentials being actualized by other things which are actual. Run that chain down. It is sitting on a desk. Now that desk is having its potential to hold up the water actualized by the legs of the desk, and the legs of the desk are having its potential to hold up the water actualized by the floor, the foundation of the house. The foundation of the house has its potential to be actualized in something which possesses the ability to hold things up, so to speak, in a non-derivative way. It doesn't require that potential to be actualized, so to speak. Now, this is just an illustration. This is not a perfect explanation of the principle. This is just
Sure.
to kind of get a mental image of the idea that you don't need a temporal series of causes going backward in time like dominoes. You can just have, let's say, like gears, right? They're all turning, and if you remove, and if you need to be able to ask, okay, what is the thing that is causing any of them to turn? Well, you can say, oh, it's just one of the gears. Well, no, that doesn't quite explain it. So that's what I'm going to argue next, is that a chain of hierarchical causes rather than a temporal series of causes, a hierarchical series of causes cannot have an infinite regress. Meaning, this gets back to the gear analogy. If you're looking at a room full of gears and all of the gears are turning, what you couldn't say is, oh, well, the gears are turning because there's an infinite amount of gears. This doesn't explain why any of the gears are actually turning. If that
Okay.
tracks.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, no, I understand the.
A hierarchical series of causes cannot regress into infinity. It doesn't explain why any of the members of the chain of causation have any causal power at all.
So let me know when you're done, and I'll bring about what my concerns are with this
Yeah.
framework.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure you've got a whole buffet serving of them. A chain of hierarchical causes must therefore terminate in something which requires no cause, which is to say, something which requires no actualization of a potential in order for it to exist. Such an actualizer would need to be purely actual, or else it would have the potential to be otherwise, which would need to be actualized, and thus the regress pushes further back. That which is purely actual would have divine attributes in virtue of its lack of limitations, since it has no potentiality which is not realized. We can kind of stop there, because I could argue for another half an hour about how pure actuality leads to divine attributes, but I'm sure that you've got more fundamental concerns.
Yeah. So I mean, I have a whole host of problems with this perspective. The first is that I think it's in direct violation with what we understand about modern physics. That
Explain.
that So you're essentially saying that causality is a fundamental aspect of reality. That there are these things that are uh, clearly causes that lead to certain effects. That's not the view that. By the way, I just noticed your Pink Floyd poster in the background. That's awesome. I love Pink Floyd. Um, just saw that in the back.
This isn't my room, but I do also like Pink Floyd.
Okay. Yeah. So the reality, from my understanding, and again, I'm not expert in this, but I've had a number of interviews with physicists on this, and I'll send you the links. Is that causality is actually emergent, not fundamental. That actually what we think of as causes at the quantum level can become effects. In fact, I think Brownlee wrote this earlier. On the quantum level, cause need not precede effects. They can follow effects. They can even cause their own effect via superposition. So when we think of, dropping a glass on the floor and the glass shattering, we think of the clear cause is that of the glass shattering is the dropping of the glass on the floor. So there is the dropping of the glass is the cause, the glass shattering is the effect, and there is this clear line from one to the other. Well, what we realize in physics is that if you think of it as a tape of the event, if you rewind the tape from the glass shattering to the glass coming back into my hand, nothing about the laws of physics have been violated. We would expect if there was a clear distinction between cause and effect as we perceive it, and if our intuitions were correct, that the laws of physics should discriminate against the difference. There should be a clear distinction between the two. Instead, there isn't. And what this is pointing to is that our assumptions and our intuitions about causality are incorrect.
Well,
There's actually
can you elaborate a little more on that? I think I might have lost you once you said once you said something about like it. Did you say something about like playing back the events in reverse?
Yes. So like what we think of as the effects of the prior causes, so the glass shattering from me dropping the glass, if we were to reverse that sequence of events, it would now seem as though it was the glass shattering that caused the glass to come back into my hand. There's nothing about the laws of physics that have been violated if you reverse the effect and the cause.
Other than the fact that you can't travel backward in time.
No, but so what they're showing here is that our intuitions that causality is this concrete thing is actually not accurate. That actually may be the case, which is, I think, actually this view of causality is one reason why people think that it might be possible to travel back in time, or at least forward, but potentially back. I'm not saying that I believe one way or another, but it seems like, some of these comments were kind of adding on to what I'm saying, like quantum physics and superposition deny the premise you put forth.
Could you explain what superposition is?
Yeah, Briley, maybe you could help me out here because I think you're more equipped to explain that. Let me just see. It was another Guido saying that he feels like. Hold on one second.
Does this have to do with Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, or is this something a bit different?
I think it's something different, but so there's another way. There are two other ways two other issues I have with this too is, like, what entails agency? Like, why can't I just suppose that things have the power to exist? And because I'm assuming that your approach here is like you're talking about sustaining causes on a Thomist view, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So have you heard of existential inertia?
Yes.
Right. So I think that would be a more parsimonious explanation than to assume that there's some agent causing all of this. Like, why can't I just posit that it's just a basic power of things to be substantiated without, assuming extra baggage? So the idea that things exist and persist in existence as a basic power, without the necessary, or without assuming some initial cause. So, like, for example,
What would this be a property of?
reality would just be a fact of
Just okay,
nature,
but what do you mean by reality?
the state of affairs, that is the state of affairs, that the motion is actually relative, and that this idea that,
If
so
you're gonna well, if you're gonna posit the idea of existential inertia, the power of it, so to speak, you're gonna need to attribute it to something. You can't just say it's attributed to the whole show, because this doesn't seem clear. Any particular part of the universe doesn't seem to possess the property of existential inertia, unless you're going to propose maybe like a fundamental particle, like a simple, which possesses existential inertia. It
well, I
just
think that it
seems on
but
the
I think that
face
it
of it to be
does though.
false.
But no, because I think, like I said, I think this view of motion is actually incorrect. I think motion is relative always to something else. So it's not
What do
that
you
things
mean?
are, so, like, this is, I think, has been the use of relativity, is that time and motion is actually relative to the observer, relative to other things, as opposed to there being this clear um, concept of motion as existing by itself. Like, let me ask you this. Like, hold on one second. Where was it? Do you think that God is pure act?
Yes.
So, if God is pure act with no unactualized potentials, then either, um, hold on a second, um, the act of His creation. Wait, hold on a second. I'm trying to find
Is
where
this
this
modal
was.
collapse?
Yeah, like, it would lead to a modal collapse, right? Like, to say, hold on. Um, yeah, one, again, I think existential inertia would be a simpler theory, but also, yeah. So one issue is, if you think God is pure act with no unactualized potentials, then either every fact that follows is necessary, or you can have access to contingent facts if and only if he posits an indeterminate link between God's creative act and the outcome. So, yeah, this basically leads to modal collapse. Um, Now, I take another. Actually, there's a better approach from my perspective than even that is,
Hmm.
um, that, again, even if we were to say that there is some necessary foundation for all things, including motion, which, again, I think your view of motion, I think, is in conflict with modern physics view of motion.
Can
But
you
let's say that it was,
explain a bit? Could you explain a bit more what
yeah. So,
just for my own sake, what you mean by the modern physics notion of motion?
So, from modern physics, we know that all motion is relative. Things are moving only relative to other things that are moving relative to them. The notion that things are naturally stopped and only move when something else pushes them is based on a terrestrial viewpoint and a lack of familiarity with the frictionless of space. Back when this no motion without a power view was plausible, it was assumed that angels had to push the planets around to keep them moving. Uh, while now, instead, it seems like this kind of frictionless view of the universe, um, is what has taken place of that original view. That that there is not this need of an uncaused cause. One, because causality is emergent anyway, but two, because time and space and motion now have all become relative in relationship to other things.
Well, sure, you could say that motion. I guess I have no problem with your account of motion on the face of it. I'm just gonna grant that it's true, just because I haven't thought that much about it, because it doesn't concern me that much. On a Thomist view, what you just described would be local motion, right? Movement in space. When Thomas Aquinas or Aristotle uses the word motion, that it would have just been the ancient vernacular for change of any kind, right?
Yeah,
So
but even change, even that, like, yeah, of course, the narrative of change, we can all agree, is something that we can observe. But, like, it's like, think of it. I'm trying to think of how to phrase this. Oh, I just want to post this comment real quick. Time is the friction of movement through the universe. Um, and so time is
It's an
relative.
interesting definition.
Time is relative to space, and space is relative to time. But I guess how I would frame it is that I think of it. Think of space and time like a book, right? Like when we read the book, we have the sense that we are moving forward. That the first chapter is leading to the second chapter, is leading to the third chapters.
Are you
So
positing the B theory of time?
yes, I think
Okay.
the B theory of time is a problem for the view you're posing.
I don't actually think it is. So
Okay.
B theory, first of all, people speak as though B theory is just it's the way that time actually is.
Right.
It is a controversial and disputed theory. It's popular right now, but your argument is kind of provisional. It may turn out that B theory is not true.
Sure.
So there's just that, but even that would just be completely granting that B theory actually does like rebut or undercut my argument, but I don't think that in the first place it even does, because the B theory of time can't actually entirely get rid of causation. For anyone listening, to give you kind of a quick rundown of the different theories of time, there's what's sometimes called the B theory, or the eternalism view of time, which is that the past, present, and the future all equally exist. It's just that we only perceive the present. Am I stating that simply well enough?
I think so.
Okay. That would be eternalism, otherwise known as the B theory of time. I actually know Catholic philosophers, not personally, but I know of Catholic philosophers who actually accept B theory and then would still use this argument. I am not convinced of B theory, but that's beside the point for now. And there's the A theories of time. There are three A theories of time that are not popular, but that are proposed. The first is presentism, which is essentially the view that only the present actually exists. The past no longer exists, and the future has yet to exist. And the only thing that actually exists is the present moment. When the present moment, when the past, I guess it doesn't even make sense to say that that the present becomes the past, because the past just doesn't exist. Present moment goes out of existence into the past. To state it in layman's terms, I'm not entirely sympathetic to presentism either. Another form of the A theory of time would be like the spotlight theory, which is kind of the most unpopular view of time, which is that the past, present, and future are all real in a way, but there's the spotlight of existence that moves across the past, present, and future.
Real
And
quick,
I'm not sympathetic to that.
how do you avoid the model collapse that I brought earlier? I don't think.
Modal collapse, I haven't studied enough on modal collapse, so
Okay.
I'm just gonna step away from an answer. Although I will
Sure, that's
note
fine.
that I don't think modal collapse necessarily argues against the existence of a simple God. It seems more like it's just an internal critique of Catholicism and the doctrine that God is free.
For me, all of this is bypassed by kind of what Graham Oppy proposes, which is, yes, there may be a necessary foundation to our reality that sets everything else into being. Whether the other things are contingent or necessary is a different question. But it's unnecessary to suppose that this foundation would have to be a god or a mind or a will, rather than just it being a force of nature. That it could be
Yeah,
the fundamental, And so, for me, again, I don't buy into the view you proposed, because I think, again, maybe I would like to have you back when I can have my brother to discuss with you, because he'll be more equipped to talking about the physics aspects of it. Like,
yeah,
my understanding of motion and causality from the conversations I've had with him is that modern physics seems to resolve these issues. That motion, as you've presented it, is inaccurate to what we know now. But I would, I think that that would be a beneficial conversation to have in more detail with somebody who's more of an expert than me.
Yeah, I think the next
Um,
time I'd come on, I'd like to provide, if I do decide to come back on, which I think I'd like to.
yeah, that would be great. Please.
I'd like to provide probably a more in detail, rigorous
Sure. And this was
case
just
for
like,
the Aristotelian argument. This is a pretty informal thing, but I
yeah,
do have some notes up. I guess what I was going to get at, but we can talk about Oppie, or I guess I can finish on your objection from the B theory of time.
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not entirely convinced that B theory is true, just because Einstein's relativity leading to B theory is an interpretation of Einstein's relativity. It doesn't
Mhm.
necessarily follow. There are people who have interpreted Einstein's theory of relativity to lead to presentism, or to the final version of the A theory of time, which would be growing block theory. This says that the present actually exists, the future does not yet exist, and the past has a kind of dead or fixed existence that can't be changed. So it's like, if the B theory of time is that what you have is, you have space, what you have is the three dimensions, right? Your height, your width, your depth. But then what you also have is a fourth dimension, which is traveling through time. And we only perceive a particular moment traveling through time, but all of the past, present, and future exists as like a block. That's why it's sometimes called the block universe theory, I guess.
Yeah, right. I want to show you a couple comments, and then we'll head out. But if you have an uncaused cause, the universe popping into existence from nothing is still more feasible than your God existing before creation.
I guess I don't quite understand the nature of that objection. It seems like like maybe I'll be getting this wrong, but it seems like maybe what they're saying is, oh well, if you're trying to say that if you're trying to say that God just exists, then why can't it just be the case that the universe just
Right.
exists?
Yeah, and
Right?
that's the following question
I
too.
think, yeah.
Yeah, like you was always existing or coming into existence without any cause.
Right. Okay. So yeah, I think that's going to get more to Graham Loppy's point, right? That
Sure.
there could be a necessary foundation of reality, but there's no reason to presume that it's God.
Right.
One
That's kind
problem,
of the sense I take. But yeah,
yeah,
go ahead.
one problem. So you think that is the stance you take? Okay. So
Yeah.
one problem I have on the face of it, and I'm sure that you'll have something to say about this, is that this sounds like a brute fact. The universe exists just because,
Mhm.
and there really isn't anything deeper. We have a series of explanations all the way down about facts about the universe, but when we get down to the fundamental, I guess you could say the bedrock level, suddenly we don't have an explanation anymore.
Sure.
Now, a brute fact is going to violate what philosophers and some scientists would call the principle of sufficient reason, which is that, you know,
But
things
yeah,
which require a cause, contingent things require an explanation for their existence or for their state of existence.
well, this wouldn't be a contingent thing anymore. It would be a
A
necessary
necessary thing.
foundation. And the thing is,
Mhm.
like, you kind of don't really escape that with proposing God to be the thing, right? Like, it ends up being the same.
Well, I guess so. To kind of address the comment, and then to talk to you about Oppie's point. To address the comment, my argument isn't that everything needs a cause, therefore, therefore the universe has God as a cause, but God doesn't need to be caused just because. My position is that contingent things need to be caused, and the universe is contingent itself. So something that is not contingent needs to be able to cause the universe. Now, I'm going to say that something that isn't contingent has divine properties. I'm not saying because the universe requires a cause, therefore God did it. I'm
Sure.
saying that whatever caused the universe is going to turn out to have attributes that we would call divine attributes.
I want
Essentially, it would have to be
before I want
God.
to show you. I want to show you a comment, another comment. Before I get to that, I want to respond to that real quick. One, from my understanding, there is no consensus in the sciences that the universe has an origin. In fact, there are models of the universe that I think bypass either an infinite regress or a starting point. And we can talk
Sure, but
about.
I'm not going to argue that the universe has to have a cause because it has an origin that extended that it had a starting point in time that
Right.
extends outward.
But you do view the
It could
universe
be
as
the case that the
contingent, and
sure.
my perspective is that, and maybe it's me that I'm missing something here, but I don't see on what grounds people make these distinctions between necessary and contingent to begin with. Like maybe logically, sure, we can use those words, that's fine. But how would we have access, like to make those distinctions existentially, we would need to have access to ontology that we can't possibly have. To know that the universe isn't necessary, to know that some things could be contingent and other things not. How do we ever know that? Like I just don't buy into that move to begin with.
I guess I'm just going to flip it back onto you and say that intuitively it seems like nothing within the universe needs to be the way that it is. So it seems kind of like a jump to say that the universe as a whole for some reason is necessary.
But
If that makes sense.
sure, but I guess my response to that would be yes, I can imagine things being different, but that doesn't mean that it could have been different. Like logically, there is no contradiction, but existentially, there very well could be. And that's what I'm saying is that uh, I think the talk about contingent and necessary to me seems more to be like a linguistic game than something that we can say with confidence has any relation to how reality actually is. But again, I'm kind of
It sounds like you're
I
just stating that it sounds like you're just restating that reality is necessary because for something to be necessary is to just say that it's real.
I'm not even just saying that. I'm saying that I think the distinction itself is problematic. That to even differentiate between what is necessary and contingent assumes far more than we should assume about our knowledge, our capacity to have access to reality.
So I guess one way to define necessary is that it has to exist in all possible worlds.
Mhm.
So if we can conceive of
So even that,
things
like, I
in
have
a
such a
see
problem with that.
if we can conceive of things in the universe not existing in all possible worlds, or the universe not existing as it does in all possible worlds, then we could just say that that at least things within the universe are contingent, and then it begs the
But
question, okay, what do you mean by a universe?
see,
It's not as though
but
the
I
universe
have a
is a
problem with that
separate
fundamentally
thing.
because the whole idea of all possible worlds, to me, it's like I can imagine that sort of stuff, that sort of idea all day long, but just because I can imagine it doesn't ground it in reality. So I can imagine a different universe. Could that mean that another universe could actually exist? That this couldn't be the only necessary
Other
universe?
than this one.
Yeah, that doesn't fall. Like to me, that's the problem, right? Like, what is it in the imagination?
So it seems like you're going to depart from even stronger I don't hold on. I want to make sure that I say this. It seems like you're going to depart from Oppie and say that like you can't make sense of like uh branches of modality at all.
Yeah, I'm very like I like Oppie's approach because I think that it basically resolves the problem for me. Where even if I was to grant the modality, it still doesn't bring you to the conclusion that you are looking for, like God being the conclusion. But from my perspective, and I may be alone in this, I'm highly skeptical of those modalities to begin with. I think
So
that
you're
they're.
like, that's a pretty intense form of determinism.
I don't know if it's. I don't know if I would even think of it as determinism. I think
It
more.
seems like that's what it entails, and like that seems like kind of
It's
the way it
more.
is.
I would actually say
You,
that it's more the result of.
everything. It seems like you're saying that everything about this universe is necessary, could not have been otherwise, and will be the way that it's going to be.
No, I'm saying that we couldn't know one way or another. So it's not so much I'm making that claim. I'm making the claim that we have no access to know one way or another. So it's, I guess it's more of a form of epistemic skepticism.
So you're just getting rid of the notion of potential. Maybe I'm misunderstanding you, but it seems
Yeah,
like you have a problem with
yeah,
the notion of potentiality altogether.
yeah, yeah.
Okay, so that's
Real
something
quick,
that I'll have to come back next time out.
yeah, I just want to post this comment real quick, and then
I just never got a chance to talk about existential inertia.
we can do that next time because I think you said you wanted to look at it more closely and then come back.
I want to look at you like your arguments more closely because again, like
Sure.
I'm definitely viewing most of the objections to this argument, and I mean you've made a lot of them. Okay, what's he
Yeah.
saying here?
My issue is that he can't account for modality unless he posits an indeterminate link between God's necessary act of creation and the outcome.
Maybe I'm not quite understanding what he's saying. Is what he's saying essentially that I still haven't explained modal collapse, so I shouldn't be talking about possible worlds at all?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I instinctively or intuitively, anytime I hear possible worlds, and I know that I'm like probably on a. Um,
You're definitely not. I definitely
in a
haven't seen
minority.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely haven't seen that kind of objection raised against this argument before, even by people like Graham Oppie or Joe Schmid. So
I
yeah.
think I'm a minority even among atheists on that perspective. But to
Mm-hmm.
me, these issues of modality and talking about possible worlds as a kind of a credible framework to talk about reality, I
See,
think that just has always bothered me, like to my core. I'm
to
like,
to be
what are
to
you?
be to be to be friendly to you, I like your taste because this was something that was actually that I was thinking a lot about leading up to this discussion. Not because I had
Hmm.
heard you say anything about it, but just because I was like, it crossed my mind and I was like, And I researched it a bit. I definitely gotta dive down that rabbit hole a bit more
It
to
may be that
see.
I'm just not
Yeah,
understanding. Like it could be that I'm just failing to understand
sure,
what's being
yeah,
expressed.
but that thought crossed my mind too, and I was like, okay, I need to look into how to object to this, and I was like, this probably won't come up. There are more pressing things that I need to get to in this time frame. Yeah, you know how it is.
Because I think that Mike and
I want to
I,
look into that.
yeah, because I think actually Mike and I may disagree on this issue of modality.
Hmm.
I want to ask him next time he can come on. Uh,
Um,
but we'll see. But anyway, yeah, we've been going for like an hour and 35 minutes. I appreciate your time
yeah,
and you coming on to discuss this. And I would love to have you back when Mike can come
sure.
on and Mike can come on. We can have a more detailed conversation.
Yeah, we can. I can definitely like kind of lay everything out instead of just kind of taking things case by case and hey, you didn't address this well enough, or
No,
hey,
and
we didn't
this
even
was
talk
just saying.
about that. Yeah.
No, but this was just more informal. See, like Mike here, he says, "Yeah, I think possible world semantics are useful." I,
Yeah.
I don't think so. I don't think that. I think that there's something about that I think is fundamentally flawed at its core. But again, it may be that I'm just not processing this correctly, and I'm sure
So
we can talk about that more. But anyway, thanks again for coming on, and thank you everybody that joined us tonight and to listen to the conversation and left your comments and everything. We'll be back sometime soon. I'm not sure exactly when, but sometime next week, I think. So I hope everybody has a safe night, and I'll see you next time.
sweet.